We're very fortunate to have Roy Harris with us today. And before we actually begin, I want to thank the members, our wonderful members of the library's Programming and Communications Committee for putting this project together, and you all know who you are. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the School of Journalism, and the School of Journalism actually brought this idea forward to us, so we really appreciate that, and the Northeastern Bookstore. The library's Meet the Authors series showcases authors whose works address current events and important social issues and brings together faculty, students, and staff to discuss and debate these issues. Please help to support our program by becoming a library supporter today. Also help to support our visiting author, Roy Harris, by purchasing his work today outside, right after the program. So Roy J. Harris Jr. has investigated the history of the Joseph Pulitzer Gold Medal for Public Service, which is awarded annually to a newspaper. And you might have all seen that most recently, the Washington Post has won for exposing the mistreatment of wounded veterans at Walter Reed Hospital. Mr. Harris is the son of a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He began his career working summers as a copy boy and later a reporter for the Post-Dispatch. In college, Mr. Harris served as managing editor of the Daily Northwestern while attending Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. After graduating, he took a job reporting for the LA Times, where one of his assignments was helping to cover the 1968 DNC in Chicago. Mr. Harris has also been a battalion writer. He has covered the aluminum industry. He's covered the aerospace beat, the 1992 race riots, the 1994 Northridge earthquake, and over the past 12 years, he has been in Boston with CFO. Mr. Harris's research for Pulitzer's Gold, and here's the illustrious work, began in 2002 when he returned to St. Louis to make a presentation on the 100th anniversary of his father's birth about the 5 public service Pulitzers won by the Post-Dispatch. Welcome, Mr. Harris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And is the lavalier working?
Can everybody hear back there?
Put it up a little bit higher. How's that? Low-tech newspaper guy always is first reflected in the microphone. Anyway, this is really exciting because the book has not been out all that long, and this is really my chance to present it to
Is the green light on?
Is the green light on?
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like it's.
Okay, yeah.
Just,
Maybe
is there volume on it?
I don't think there's volume on
I
that.
could use the other mic if you want.
If that's more comfortable.
Sure. Sounds like it's working. Okay, might as well use the powers that we have here. It's funny when that introduction sort of covered the duty stations that I had along the way. It always sounds rather weird, you know, covered the 1992 race riots, which is true. But what race riots were those? Does anybody remember what happened in 1992? In LA? Yeah, it was the Rodney King thing. And to me, it comes back so personally because I was trapped downtown with my wife, and we couldn't get back to our apartment. So these kinds of, a lot of these stories, the ones that I'm involved in, unfortunately never been involved in a Pulitzer Prize story myself until I started doing this book. But these things sometimes seem very personal, but that's what that was all about. I was in Los Angeles for the Wall Street Journal for 20 years, and my career with the Wall Street Journal was 23 years long. So the aerospace part of it was in LA, and the metals part of it, the aluminum that you heard about, was when I worked in Pittsburgh, which is where I started with the Journal. But anyway, we'll kind of run through a few of those things. The main reason, obviously, I'm here today is that this this 5-year project of mine to turn out this book has finally come to fruition. On January 17th, the book was published, and I never thought that I would get here. So all of this is really the cream now to actually be able to talk about what was produced over this time, because I really didn't think it was going to happen. So thank you very much for having me here, and we're going to cover a lot of journalism history, way too much to cover in just an hour, but it's strangely enough, considering that these prizes won the Pulitzer Prize, it is history that has not been very well covered. One would think that with these prizes, that is our Joseph Pulitzer Medal, that's the back side of it. That was designed in 1920, even though the first prize was in 1918. They didn't get the medal done until a couple years later. It's hard to think of the Pulitzer Prize as being something that nobody really knew about, but when the Pulitzer Prizes started in 1917, it was almost totally disregarded. And in fact, it was viewed as something of a joke that anybody would give a prize for newspaper writing. Might even think that's the case today, but back then it was really a joke because we were coming out of the yellow journalism period, and newspaper writing, especially that by Joseph Pulitzer's own publications, which were deeply involved in the yellow journalism period, along with William Randolph Hearst's papers, were considered pretty disreputable organs. And the Pulitzer Prizes, I think, actually helped newspaper reporting elevate itself, which we'll talk a little bit about. So basically, just to give you an overview of the book, the idea of this was to look at one prize that was awarded as part of the Pulitzer Prizes over the 90 years, now 91 years, of the Pulitzer Prizes since 1917, the first one, and to kind of give a sense of what the American press was doing in terms of public service over that period. The idea was to look at the kinds of stories that were being covered, the way they were being covered, and the reason I got into this, I'll tell you a little bit about this St. Louis connection that you heard about, but what really hit me that led me to believe that this book needed to be done was that no one had ever looked at the Pulitzer Prizes from the standpoint of this one award. And my feeling was when I got into it that the award itself had kind of been lost in history, and a lot of these stories were kind of buried in corners of libraries, dust covered, and I thought they really needed to be told. What I found was that you could not only get a real sense of history, of US history, by looking at these prizes, but you would certainly learn a lot about how American journalism evolved over those years. When I started doing this 5 years ago, I was not writing into an environment of the disappearing newspaper. At least I didn't think that I was writing into an environment of the disappearing newspaper. So the whole idea of this project has morphed a little bit the last couple of years as people are wondering what's going to happen now to the newspaper business. So the idea was to celebrate some of these stories that I believed had kind of been lost to time. Even though they had their Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame, they then were not really discussed very much, what these prizes were. And it seemed to me that discussing them again and putting them in the context of a developing award from 1917 on till today could really tell us something that we didn't know. So this is a little bit about the organization. Did not come intuitively. It was an organization that really needed to be hammered out in many different drafts. A little bit like writing a feature story for those of you who have been involved with journalism, print journalism, and have to figure out a way to lead and how to develop the story. It's a bit of a behemoth to take a feature story and turn it into a book, but essentially it did follow the same kind of pattern. The idea of the book was to start with realizing that readers are going to be fairly impatient people. To start with some of the newer prizes, the ones that are really going to grab people's attention. And in Boston, you might immediately think of maybe the one story you know of as being a gold medal winner, which is the Boston Globe's disclosures about the Catholic Church and the pedophile priests. That was a story that really gripped me from the beginning and was one that I wanted to have right at the top of the book. It was originally going to be the opening chapter, ended up being chapter 3. and 5. We'll get to that in a minute. So I start out telling some of the more recent stories that people will have heard about, where there's been some coverage about how these stories were written, because there is, after all, a Columbia Journalism Review. There's a Poynter Institute. There are people out there who want to tell a little bit of the story behind the story. But at Pulitzer time, with 14 journalism awards coming out, it's very difficult to give a total immersion kind of view of what went into that story. And it was remarkable to me, and it's emblematic of what I encountered in doing this story, that when I began to explore the Boston Globe story and began to talk to the team members led by Walter Robinson, who's one of your esteemed professors here, the situation was that no one had ever done this. No one had talked to these people. No one had asked them how the story came about. There had been a few little stories about it, but basically that kind of total immersion, the way they would report the story if they were reporting it, had never been done. And time after time during these 90 years, the 90 years of prizes that I was covering, I found that to be the case, that these stories had never been explored beyond the slightest scratch, something in an editor and publisher magazine, for example, that would have a 3 or 4 paragraph summary of the prize. Very rarely would the individuals themselves be mentioned, because these prizes all went to the newspaper. It's one of the rules of the public service Pulitzer Prizes that always goes to the newspaper and not to individuals. So we have these more recent ones that we start with, and you'll recognize some of those. 2002, you figure, is probably going to have something to do with 9/11, and does, in fact, of course. Times-Picayune and Sun-Herald is going to be Hurricane Katrina. So these stories will be very fresh when you start the book. You'll have this sense of, ripped from more recent headlines. Then the idea was to go back to the early years. And when you heard that I started my career at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, there's a fortuitous little connection there, in that the Post-Dispatch was a Joseph Pulitzer newspaper. Joseph Pulitzer founded that newspaper, actually built it by bringing together 2 newspapers in St. Louis. He's a Hungarian immigrant who moved to St. Louis. Then he moved to New York and started the New York World. And so it turned out that I had quite a connection with the Pulitzer family. You heard that I started as a copy boy. One of my occasional jobs was to bring coffee, as I recall it was 1 cream and 2 sugars, to Joseph Pulitzer III, who was the owner at the time of the paper, then later went public, and he was then the controlling shareholder. But it was very exciting, and he kept all of the gold medals in his office. So I would see them there outside when I was coming in bringing the coffee. So I had a sense of this, along with the sense that my father had given me about it, but somehow that connection with the Joseph Pulitzer family ended up being very valuable to me, because I found this was a way, in this coming of age part of it, was a good way to keep up with the history of the prizes. A Joseph Pulitzer actually was chairman of the board of the Pulitzer Prize board for 70 of the first years of the prizes. It stopped in 1986, when that same Joseph Pulitzer that I used to bring coffee for, when he retired and then later died. So that part 2 is a little bit, we'll talk about, is a little bit of background of the prizes. I just found myself getting enthralled with the idea of how the prizes work, the deep, dark secrecy of the prizes. And so I spent a little bit of time with that. I figured readers would like that too. There just hasn't been enough told about how the Pulitzer Prizes work. Part 3, I fell in love with the 70s, which is when I started working at the Wall Street Journal, and a lot of good stories happened in the 70s. There was really no good excuse for me to spend a whole section with the 70s, except that I figured, hell, this is my book. And I really love the 70s. The stories in there just seem so vivid, and I was able to find the people still around from those stories. So you'll hear, as I go through some of the 70s, why I like them so much. Basically, those David and Goliath tales. You think of the Washington Post and Watergate, but there were so many little tiny papers that just for some reason in the 70s became, caught the spotlight and won the Public Service Prize. And then, after the 70s, I had to go back into the 80s and 90s and bring us back into the 21st century. So that was the way I did it. I tried to organize the last few chapters. Organization of a book is a lot tougher than organizing a feature story. And I had to take a little poetic license here. I essentially made the 80s. I looked for a concentration of stories in a certain area, and basically what I found was that in the 80s you could find a lot of stories about business, and the 90s you could find a lot of stories about the environment and nature. And so I kind of stayed with that theme just as a way to kind of keep the reader hooked. This was not this year, but last year, 2007. This is the way it looks when the Pulitzer Prizes are announced. It's an incredibly old-fashioned ceremony. You always see pictures if you're a junkie like me into how the Pulitzer Prizes are awarded on that day and have been for a few years. You always see reporters huddled around a computer screen, but this is how it's first announced. Sig Gisler is the administrator of the prizes at Columbia, and he just kind of drones on in the journalism school at Columbia, and as soon as he starts talking, people grab the press releases and run out. If anybody has covered the newspaper, has been a newspaper reporter for over a decade like me, this is a throwback to the way it was in the 60s and 70s. The one thing that this reminds me of, though, is this is one of those weird books that a week ago became obsolete, because when they announced the new Pulitzer Prizes and the Washington Post won the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, all of a sudden I was a year behind. So we have to wait for the second edition to find out about the Washington Post. The winner that last year was the Wall Street Journal, which was the first time they'd won a Public Service Prize, and that was neat for me because that's where I spent most of my career. This is the team that won the Public Service Prize for the Boston Globe. And I'll just kind of show you this for a minute because there's a good reason we have to rush on with this. I did get very interested in the Boston Globe story and how it had never really been explored by an outsider. And what I found was that the reporters and the editors felt the same way. I mean, they obviously were honored to have won this prize, but it was a 2-year reporting effort, and that no one had dived in to tell this story from the reporter's standpoint about how they broke the story, how it happened. I think they were almost as thrilled as I was. I don't think I really bothered anybody that much because they wanted to sit down and tell their stories. And I found this over and over again in doing my research that the reporters I talked to and the editors I talked to really wanted to get their stories out there. What was fascinating about this and the way it works, the reason it works so well in the book, is that as they were reporting this story, when they first began to get the break in this story, it actually happened, I kid you not, on Marty Barron, second from the right over there, on his first day on the job. He came in from Miami, where he'd been editor at the Miami Herald, and that is when he began to explore the idea of essentially why was the Boston Globe behind on this story? Why hadn't they been able to get the story in any kind of a fashion other than he says, she says, about the complaints about Father Gagan and the other Catholic priests? And it was only at that point they decided, well, we should explore seeing if we could get the court files unsealed. The Catholic Church always sealed these court files, and so no one could write a full story on what was going on. And to me, it was just amazing. It had been written before that it was the first day on the job. It had never hit me between the eyes like it did when I started talking to the team, that this was, not just a Hollywood ending to this story, but a Hollywood beginning. So that's the way that chapter started. But what made this so amazing was that they were deeply involved in this story. They had begun to unravel things. They didn't quite have the court cases unsealed, but they had definitely gotten ahead of it to where at the end of 2001, they felt like they were going to be able to come out with a series of stories before the end of the year. And my guess is that they were positioning themselves to get these stories out and submit them for a Pulitzer Prize. And even though word hadn't been written except for a couple of columns. And as they were beginning to prepare this and hoping to get the court files unsealed, there was another news event down the coast. And literally, the whole team, the Boston Globe Spotlight team that was working on the story about the Catholic Church, were torn from the assignment because of 9/11. 9/11 was very much a local story. 2 of the planes had taken off from Logan, and it was a local story really everywhere in the country and maybe in the world. But to me, from a dramatic standpoint for the book, it was a very powerful illustration about there is no story so important that another story can't take its place in the flash of an eye. And that's what happened here. It works in the book because I'm telling this, building up the story of how the Globe is working on this, and then all of a sudden they're all pulled off. And for a lot of us, if you're from the Boston area or from New York for that matter, it probably have a very visceral reaction to that. So they didn't win the prize in 2001. They literally had not written a word of this story. Everything they entered to win the prize in 2003 had been written in in the paper in 2002. That's the way the Pulitzers work. They always give the prize in April for the work that's done the prior year, which I think will change in the future, but that's the way it's been for a long time now. So what wins the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in the year 2002? Well, it's the New York Times. And one of the things that's amazing about the Public Service Prize, unlike an investigative prize or a feature writing prize, is that public service can be defined in all sorts of ways. It doesn't even have to be a story. And in fact, the New York Times won for no single story, for no series of stories. They won for having essentially invented the idea of a nation challenged. A lot of interesting wrinkles to that, including that they had a section that you could turn upside down. They had run out of space to have a full front page, so they put it on the opposite side of the sports section. And if you happen to be reading the paper back there all those years ago, you might remember that you literally had to turn the paper around to get the full front page on the other side of the section. It's a complex old text situation where they only had a certain number of sections where they could display pages, and that's how they managed to do it. But that trick of having to turn the section upside down is not why they won the prize. They won it because a nation challenge represented such a novel and truly amazing way of marshaling all the forces, the global, the local, the national reporters, to be able to put stories in the same section. And Laurel Leff, who worked with me at the Wall Street Journal for a while, remembers how important it was when you wrote a story for the Wall Street Journal that story be on the front page. If it was going to be inside the paper, that was a devastating blow to something that you worked on for a long time. Well, the editors had to really work with the reporters to get them to accept that a story that ran in the Nation's Challenge section would be as significant or could be as significant as a front page story. Not sure they ever quite got there, but it certainly was a much more accepted thing as they went ahead with it. The thing most people, I think, who were following the New York Times during that period, the thing they remembered about this Nation Challenge section was this one page that ran within the section every day, the Portraits of Grief. And as you can see here, that in my view, one of the wonderful things about this was that we now, those of us who read that every day, think of it as, well, that was just so natural. That was the way to treat this. But it was not an intuitive kind of approach to this. These were not traditional obituaries. In fact, when they started running these, they did not know who was dead, who was missing. And so they had to come up with some way to kind of hedge around that. Portraits of Grief, when you think about it, is a far cry from Portraits of Death. And so the idea was that if people were missing, you could still say there's grief here. As I mentioned in the side here, the editors who came up with this idea, and it was not a popular idea originally, they had to kind of rush it through, and these were decisions that were being all made day to day. What's going to be in the paper tomorrow? How are we going to solve this problem tonight? they had to push this through the editors all the way up and down the chain, and they did get the idea basically from having seen these missing posters floating around the town, which had this kind of this feel to them that they were trying to duplicate here. Again, the thing that truly amazed me was with the time that I spent at the New York Times, no one had ever asked the New York Times, the people at the New York Times, how this all came about. There had been a few little stories about the Nation Challenged, but in terms of the project, how it went, starting at the lowest levels from the editor who came up with the idea, how it bubbled up to the top, how it was approved, how this came to be, no one had ever asked them. I was absolutely stunned. They were telling me this stuff for the first time. My main source in the editorial ranks at the New York Times was Gerald Boyd, who was the managing editor, and who had been the managing editor for 1 week when the planes hit the World Trade Center. You're beginning to hear a theme here. 1 day for Marty Barron, 1 week for Gerald Boyd. It was a little bit different, but the truth is you can never be prepared for these kinds of stories. So Gerald Boyd, who died, I guess about 6 months after I interviewed him, so that was a bit of a shock. He was quite a young man, and his career took a bit of a turn with the Jason Blair scandal. A year after the New York Times won 7 Pulitzer Prizes out of the 14 categories in 1 year. A year after that, he and his boss, Howell Raines, the executive editor, were both gone in the Jason Blair scandal. You can tell there are a lot of strings that come out of these stories. Okay, so what happens after 9/11? Well, for the Boston Globe, a lot. After months of working on the terrorism beat, reporters going down to Florida to find out about the terrorists who had learned how to fly airplanes, or at least had learned how to keep the altitude, as you remember that story. A few people down at that Florida aviation school were interested that these people were not interested in learning how to land the plane. Could have been a tip-off. But they did learn how to maintain altitude. After reporting those kinds of stories, the Globe Spotlight team came back in and started working on the pre-stories. And that's when they were able to finally get the cases unsealed. And it led to what I consider to be one of the greatest of the public service prizes. Looking at the 90 years, I think this one really stands out. When you're looking for gimmicks to try to present 90 years of reporting in some way, different ideas just jump out at you. And the one that came to me was that there were some parallels between the 9/11 coverage of the New York Times and the Boston Globe coverage coming in 2 successive years, 2002 and 2003, to some stories that had run 30 years before. And we'll run into those when we get to the 70s, and I'm talking about the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. All right, well then, again, we're still in section 1 of this book, and a couple more prizes happened between 2002 and 2003. New York Times wins again, and the Los Angeles Times wins. The 5th time that both of those papers had won a public service prize. And then in 2005, we have Hurricane Katrina, and 2 newspapers win in the year 2006, the Times-Picayune and the Sun-Herald of Biloxi, Mississippi. The Times-Picayune, as you may recall, was driven out of their headquarters. They operate, you can still see the building down there, they operated out of this bunker that was meant to totally resist hurricane and looked pretty solid. The problem was that it wasn't meant to resist flooding if the canals broke. So they did okay with the wind damage, but the floods came up to the doorstep and drove them out. So this is right outside their door as they begin to look for higher ground. That's Jim Amos, 3rd guy from the left, in the center, who's the editor of the Times-Picayune. Theirs was a wonderful story of a newspaper thoroughly wounded by this storm and recovering, not just to put out a paper eventually, but to put out a really brilliant paper. One of the things that they did so beautifully was to debunk a lot of the things that were being spread around by blogs. Without a newspaper, rumors begin to grow pretty easily, and some of those rumors are way off base. Some of you may remember reading, for example, about the murders and gang rapes taking place in the convention center and of little children. And one of the things they did was to investigate those reports thoroughly and to find that some of them were urban legend, not very pretty ones. The other paper that won, this was unusual for the Pulitzer board to award two prizes for the same year. This was actually the one that the jury nominated. The jury did not submit the Times-Picayune as one of their choices. It's arcane little rules. One of the rules is the jury, which is made up of reporters from around the country. It's a very diverse group. They get together and their instructions are to present 3 candidates to the board. Theoretically supposed to be a winner and 2 finalists, but the jury is not allowed to say 1, 2, 3, this is our pick. This has evolved over the years. And so the board doesn't want to be told what their favorite is. They just want to be told, give us 3 and we'll do the rest because we are the Pulitzer Prize board. So their view was that, the jury's view was that, well, we don't want to give, if we can only give you 3, we don't want to give you 2 Hurricane Katrina stories. So we'll pick 1 Hurricane Katrina story and then 2 other really great stories, and we'll submit those. And then they had an addendum to their suggestion saying, you know, there are these 3 alternates we want to submit. And in fact, they left this hint that if you really like the Sun Herald story, maybe you ought to give 2 awards. But, and this was all in secret. You know, people were able to leak a few things to me about what happened afterwards. So the Sun Herald, this is, I mean, you can just tell from this front page the way they were viewing this that made it so remarkable. First of all, this was the day after the storm. They were able to continue printing because they worked out a deal with the Columbus Ledger-Inquirer Inland, which was another Knight Ridder paper, part of their chain. And the Columbus, Georgia paper printed their paper for them and they delivered it in by truck. So people were just amazed that there really was a paper that day. But what a paper it was. I mean, looking at these, you can just see how the jury and how the Pulitzer board would be bowled over by this. When you think of this happening, you know, during the storm. This goes back. All right, so section 1 is then about these up-to-date stories. I ran out of time, unfortunately, with the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal, which won for reporting on stock option backdating and essentially breaking that story, really. I mean, you can always say other people had that story first. That's this very much the argument with the Globe, too, is other people had reported about Father Gagan and the pedophile priests. Other people had reported about stock option backdating, but the Journal did a great job with it. I had to stick that in the afterword because the book was already finished. So, first part of the book's about these recent prizes. Then we go back into history. And what's really kind of cool about this is that, you know, it was like learning about my own family past in a way. 2002 was the year that my dad was born. And in St. Louis, which is where Joseph Pulitzer was from, or had moved to. And in 2002, I was able to find a memo that's still kept in a plastic envelope in the archives at Butler Library and at Columbia University. I was able to find the memo where he dictated to his social secretary this idea for having prizes for journalism. In the same memo, he thought there should be prizes for journalism, and he also thought that there should be, ridiculous idea, a school that would teach journalists, just like doctors and lawyers. At the time, that was outrageous. So Columbia University School of Journalism, Graduate School of Journalism came from that. They ended up not being the first school of journalism. The first school of journalism is University of Missouri, that beat them by a few years. But this house had burned down, but my wife and I did drive out to Bar Harbor and found the lot where this house had been. And Joseph Pulitzer, who was like this character from a Edgar Allan Poe novel, you know, he couldn't stand loud noises, and he was almost blind. And the tower, they called it the Tower of Silence on the far right side. That's where he would go to think deep thoughts. And this is supposedly where he was when he thought, maybe there should be awards for journalism. Nobel Prizes had just come out, so that's probably a little bit what prompted him in coming up with this. I spend a little time musing about that in the book. That's Joseph Pulitzer on the left, and his son Ralph on the right. Ralph was the editor of the New York World. Just gives you an idea of what they looked like back then when he was dreaming up this idea, walking along Fifth Avenue. And then I'll just kind of run past this. This is the guy I used to bring the coffee to, Joseph Pulitzer III. They're an interesting family. Joseph Pulitzer Jr., that's Joseph Pulitzer, the old guy who invented the prizes, and he left prizes in his will. He was dead by the time the prizes came out, of course. That's the way wills work, right? And so 6 years after he died, the first Pulitzer Prizes came out, and his son, Joseph Pulitzer Jr., did not use Joseph Pulitzer Jr., he used Joseph Pulitzer. And Joseph Pulitzer III used Joseph Pulitzer Jr. So it gets very confusing. You have to kind of translate as you go along reading their memoirs, which I had to do. But these guys, the two, the one in the center and the one on the right, for 70 years were the ones who were the chairperson of the board. So by going through their letters and their memoranda, I was able to get a really good sense of what was going on in the board from year to year. There have been a few books written about the Pulitzer Prizes, but I think, and I obviously use those as references, but I really don't think anybody quite got into it the way I did. So if you also happen to be interested in how the Pulitzer Prizes work, you'll probably get a lot out of the way it's done in the book. It is not a dry history. I think anybody who's read this or read any part of it will realize I tried to use all of my Wall Street Journal kind of skills that Laurel and I picked up, trying not to write dry business stories, to try and make the thing quite readable. So you'll see a lot of, my model was All the President's Men, to kind of get you into the newsroom and think, wow, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's next? So that's even true with some of these really old stories. This was the first public service Pulitzer Prize winner. There was no public service prize given in 1917, and you think, well, why a Pulitzer Prize? How could they not give a prize? Well, back then, nobody entered. Nobody knew what the heck it was. So I tried to figure out why there was no prize in 1917, but that's about as close as I could come, is that it just wasn't anything that was entered that the judges cared much about. And frankly, most of the judges didn't turn up. There were only half of them came to Columbia for the meeting, and it was just kind of a mess in 1917. They just gave out a couple of awards. But in 1918, they had some really good stuff. This was another case of not a prize being given for a story, but essentially for a philosophy, and it was the New York Times again. This idea that the newspaper decided that during World War I, what people really needed was to have the original documentation, what the diplomats were saying to each other, what the speeches were saying. And it was essentially a testament to the people of New York. You deserve better than interpretation. You deserve the real thing. So that's that text of the president's address. This is one of my favorites. Okay, I have to run over this quickly, but because we've got to get out of the 20s, right? The idea was, as I got into this, was to try and use some of these stories to capture what was going on in the country so that you could really get a sense of American history by looking at the prizes that I selected from this decade. And to me, what better story for the craziness of the 20s, the jazz era, than a total huckster who came up with an investment scam on the basis that he'll double your money in 45 days. People believed it, people invested, and this was Charles Ponzi. A number of you may have heard of the Ponzi scheme. It's still used to describe this phony kind of pyramid scheme where the early investors put down money and then the later investors come in and what they're doing essentially is paying off the early guys, and eventually it all peters out. It's fairly complex, but it makes people very wealthy. And that's what it did for Charles Ponzi. The Boston Post, which is later closed down, and its rights were bought by the Boston Globe in the 40s, did this wonderful story. The whole community totally believed that Charles Ponzi was this investment savior. And in fact, you know, at the beginning he was paying off doubling people's money in 45 days. And what they did was they found out that he had a record in Canada, that he was a fraud artist. And there's a couple things about this page. I just love this. This is the kind of thing you uncover when you're doing a book, and you never think you're gonna find all this stuff. Once they found his mugshot from Canada, they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll create another mugshot of the way he looks today. They actually painted a mustache on him so that he would look like the one that's up here. But the reason this page kind of grabs me is that he had become the most popular person in Boston. And 2 years before, the most popular person in Boston had been Babe Ruth. But he got sold to New York, and he became the most hated person in Boston. So another story on this front page, Ruth injures knees sliding. I just love that. It's, you know, talk about ripped from the headline. You also see that women who were not able to vote had a victory in Tennessee and were well on the way to getting the franchise. And then, as if that weren't enough, you see down here an ad for Northeastern College School of Law. So there were advertisements on the front page, and one of them was from your esteemed institution. See how you can really get into this stuff? Ugh. All right, so we jump ahead 3 decades. You know, what I try to do again is just pick a few stories from each decade, so you really get a sense. And for the 20s, you know, you've got that. What else do you think of in the 20s? Maybe begin to get into urban crime, you know, that Al Capone era. There's a lot of urban crime going on, so I got a story like that. There's a story of an editor who was actually killed by mobsters in Canton, Ohio, and the paper goes on to fight the mobsters. This could have been a movie script. And that newspaper, the Canton, Ohio Daily News, wins the Public Service Pulitzer Prize in the late 20s. So and then the 30s, you think the Depression, you think the Dust Bowl. There, in fact, was a newspaper that won for just a brilliant environmental story about the Dust Bowl. And it was telling people in Bismarck, North Dakota, how to cope with the Dust Bowl and trying to give them the power so that they could stay in their community and not have to be driven west. It's amazing to find these stories. They just had been lost to time. In the 40s, obviously, you get into another world war. But I'll just jump ahead, since I have to do that, to the 50s. And this was Little Rock Central High School desegregation. And I tell the story of how Harry Ashmore, the editor there, had tried to arrange for a peaceful desegregation. His view was that that his community was being tested, and that that it was a chance for local people to stand up and say, we are law-abiding citizens. We will do what the Supreme Court wants us to do. And that didn't work out so well. But the paper was actually very sad for him, but this was the paper. The day, the editorial said, the crisis that Mr. Faubus made. Faubus was the governor of Arkansas. So this was another, you know, period in history that is captured by these stories. Fits in very nicely with my theme of being able to talk about U.S. history. All right, got to move through the 50s and the 60s. The 60s were an interesting period, but we'll skip them. And in 1971, the New York Times gets the Pentagon Papers, and it says 72 because that's the year they won the prize. But a lot of you probably know from a historical standpoint how important the Pentagon Papers were, in that the Nixon administration and the Attorney General John Mitchell attempted to stop the New York Times from publishing this history of the Vietnam War that was actually the government's own history. So the New York Times' view was, look, what is this about stolen documents? They were stolen documents, but it's the government's own history of the Vietnam War. We're really, and who's the government? You know, it's like us. So this was their philosophy. Neil Sheehan was the guy who secured these papers, and that's the way it looked. That was after they won the Supreme Court case, and here's the Pentagon Papers resuming here, and the news story about their having won that fight. Probably as much as the fight that they won to get the papers back in the public eye, had as much to do with their winning the prize. It was a very controversial prize, which I go into in the book a bit. And it's also a prize that's connected very much to the next prize. In 1972, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein get on to some angles of this bugging of the Watergate apartment building, office building, that no one else has. And we all pretty much, if you've seen All the President's Men, you know that story. It's one of the few cases that's really much more covered in the world than I could ever do in this book. I was dreading doing this chapter. I was absolutely dreading it. I knew I had to cover Watergate. Pentagon Papers was a little bit easier because every editor at the New York Times wrote a book on the Pentagon Papers. All I had to do was really go back in there and find out what they had said, kind of try to eliminate the contradictions where I could. And then I found someone who had worked on the Pentagon Papers and talked to him about what it was like to be a young reporter working on the Pentagon Papers. And I had to look a long way. I live in North Hingham. I had to look all the way to South Hingham to find Fox Butterfield, who was a young reporter at the New York Times, who was the first reporter dragged in to work with Neil Sheehan on that story. So you get a first-hand story. It's not all just Seymour Topping and the editors of the New York Times talking about this. You also get to hear what it was like to be a reporter working on the Pentagon Papers. And here, I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a lot of time with Bob Woodward, who seemed to be ready, although people are asking about Watergate all the time. He seemed to be ready to kind of tell his story all over again in the wake of having disclosed who Deep Throat was. So that was kind of fun. Probably, he had just turned out his book on that, The Secret Man, and he sat down with me, and he really loved the idea that we were going to look at these stories that had maybe not gotten so much attention, unlike Watergate. I just love this picture. It kind of says it all. Carl Bernstein, who of course is a BU guy, was not trusted at all by Katharine Graham, who loved Bob Woodward. And doesn't that picture say it? All sorts of stories about Carl Bernstein. I will add that Carl Bernstein never kept his appointments for an interview with me. So one of these days he may do that. But the book is told from Bob Woodward and Ben Bradley's point of view. That chapter, that is. Katharine Graham, unfortunately, was gone. This was my favorite picture in the book. You have to go way, way back to standing type, but this is Ben Bradley looking at the hard type of the page that says Nixon resigns. Can't do that these days. Just jumping again, just to give you an idea that some of these stories are really kind of fun and not old dry history. Jumping a few years, I told you I love the 70s. There are a whole bunch of these David and Goliath stories. But the Point Reyes Light is perhaps the smallest paper. There have been a number of small papers to win, but one of the smallest papers to win the Public Service Pulitzer Prize. And it was a little weekly paper in West Marin County, Northern California. And they had been following this group called Synanon, which is a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, except for recovering druggies. And it had just gone totally haywire. It had become this armed camp, and you could see that in their working on, they became, had stashes of weapons. They were making a lot of money, and had airplanes and boats and all this stuff. And they were really, the editor, Dave and Kathy Mitchell, were really kind of surprised at all this happening. And while they were reporting this story, probably would have just been another good story, but while they were reporting this story, down in Los Angeles, a lawyer who had been filing cases against Synanon came home, actually it was World Series Day. He came home to watch the World Series in his home and reached into his mailbox, and a de-rattled rattlesnake had been stuffed in there. And the brilliant people who did it were from Synanon. They were driving a Synanon van. There were people in the neighborhood who saw the van, who took the license plate. It probably took about 12 minutes to capture these guys, and the whole story just kind of unrolled from there. But it put the whole story in the national spotlight. You know, lawyer attacked by a rattlesnake. The Point Reyes Light became the national expert in this whole Synanon issue. People called them, and sure enough, they won the prize. Here's Paul Morantz, who by the weirdest coincidence in the world, like having Fox Butterfield live in Hingham, Paul Morantz and I were softball buddies in Los Angeles. I was working at the Wall Street Journal, and we were on the same softball team. Oh, well, so I got to talk to him, and he remembered what this was all like and what he'd gone through with all of this. He became an instant Andy Warhol celebrity himself, the lawyer who was attacked by the rattlesnake. And in case you wonder, so that's in the book too. So that's the Point Reyes Light. Fascinating story because it's this little tiny paper that all of a sudden becomes the center of attention. And when you talk to the reporters there and the editors there, you just get this amazing sense of what it was like to win the biggest prize in the country. And the way I end that chapter is that the editor is saying, you know, it's sort of like you're out playing football in the backyard and you throw the ball and somebody makes a great catch and you say, God, with a catch like that, you could play for the 49ers. So, yeah, that's true. With a story like that, you could win the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, except they did it. Pages are getting a little out of it. Okay. Oh, Paul Morantz, there he is. He's still alive, he's doing fine. He's still a lawyer. Gonna jump again. I've jumped to this one because this is one I can actually tell. You know, the Point Reyes Light, I ran over, 6 months of work that they did. I do love this story. Gil Gall, who now is with the Washington Post, in 1989, this will give you an idea of how these stories can happen and why it's not a bad idea to stay in the newspaper business even though you think it might be folding. 1989, he was working for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was a business reporter, and his specialty was medical business, which was a little bit unusual back then. And he really didn't have this this idea for business reasons, really. He was giving blood, and it began to occur to him when he was watching the blood flow out of his arm that he really didn't know what happened to the blood. And he thought, this might make an interesting business story. He pitched it to his business editor, and the business editor, who was also a blood donor, said, I don't know either. What does happen to the blood? So he goes to the local Red Cross office, and he says to the head of the Red Cross office, so I'm going to do this story on blood, and I'm just wondering, what happens when you give blood, goes in throughout the tube, and you have this thing of blood, like, what's a liter of blood cost, and what do you do with it when it leaves your place? What is it with this blood? And the guy looked at him and said, why are you asking these questions? We don't have to tell you a thing about this. The antenna just started wobbling, and Gil Gall realized that there was something here that he should pursue. And sure enough, it turned out that there was this very secretive industry, a commodity that was being traded, was totally unregulated. And this was also right about at the time when AIDS in the bloodstream, in the blood community became a huge concern. He didn't even know that when he started doing this. He wasn't thinking about that at all. But by the time he was done, he had this amazing story about the blood industry. And one of the great contributors to that was the editor, the executive editor of the paper, a fellow named Gene Roberts, who is a legend, still around, still with us, teaching at the University of Maryland. And he was the editor of the paper who had turned the Philadelphia Inquirer totally around. I tell a story about Gene Roberts. It's too good to pass up, where he had been a reporter, covered civil rights for the New York Times. He had worked for the Washington Post, and he always wanted to run a paper. But his philosophy was that he wanted to turn a paper around. He wanted a paper that was beyond reclamation. And one day he went to visit the guy who was at Knight Ridder, who owned Knight Ridder. And the guy said, you know, Gene, I've got the paper for you. It's the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Gene Roberts looked at it and said, boy, that's what I want to do. He went to a guy named Steve Lovelady, who was working at the who was working at the Wall Street Journal as a page one rewrite guy and was the best pure writer that Gene Roberts knew. And he said, see, Steve, I'd really like to have you come work at the Philadelphia Inquirer with me. And Lovelady said, Gene, any place that you're going to run, I will go, without any question. That is just fantastic. I'll work for you. So then he went back and he got a couple of weeks of Philadelphia Inquirers. He started looking at it. And he called Gene Roberts back and said, Gene, I know I committed to take this job, but I've been looking at the Philadelphia Inquirer for the last couple of weeks. This is the biggest piece of crap that I've ever seen. This is the worst newspaper. This newspaper is totally beyond salvation. And Gene Roberts said to him, yeah, isn't it great? And in the 17 years that Gene Roberts ran the Philadelphia Inquirer, they won 18 Pulitzer Prizes, including 2 for public service, and 1 was this guy's. And you figure, well, this is the story about the blood industry. What did Gene Roberts have to do with it? Well, Gene Roberts had a lot to do with it. He encouraged reporters to pursue that kind of story. He gave them the time off to do it. And even though this was kind of unusual for a public service prize, it was a one-person job. I do give credit to the editors all up and down the line, because they all contributed to it. But Gene Roberts' big contribution was, as Gil Gall tells it, he looked at the 5 parts of the series, and he said, well, Gil, he's from North Carolina, he said, well, Gil, this is good stuff. He says, but don't you think you want to lead with your strongest story? And Gil looked at it, and sure enough, the strongest story was number 5, because Gil was going to build this up so that you're reading the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the 5th day, then they're really going to hit you with, you know, the news. That's why you've been reading the story for 5 days. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So the most important story became the first story. Very quickly on to the Washington Post, since they're in the news again. This was a great story, and we're getting back towards the 21st century, so I'll shut up. But this is the Washington Post team. Jeff Lean was the editor, second person from the right. The guy on the far right is Rick Atkinson, who is now a very, very popular, best-selling nonfiction writer, Army at Dawn, retired from the Post and making a lot more money than he ever made at the Post. And what this team did is they took a statistic, and it just showed that there were more, in Washington, D.C., there were more civilians who were being shot by police in various kinds of altercations than anywhere else in the country. And the first reaction was, well, you know, that statistic is probably an 8-paragraph story. You know, it's interesting. But they decided they would pursue that. The statistic had been found by an intern, essentially. It's the one in the black outfit there. I never did meet her. She moved on, but she was an intern. And they began to work on this story, and they began to find all the reasons why that was the case, why Washington was so unusual. And they identified problems with the weapon that was being used, with police training, and they really pulled together an amazing story where they looked at case after case of shootings, and they looked at how it had happened and what the damage was and the human drama of it. And so that case of police gunplay won the Pulitzer Prize in 1990. And amazingly enough, the next year, the Washington Post won again for a series that's actually quite similar in my mind, although they probably don't know it. I haven't talked to Dana Priest and Ann Hall yet, the 2 reporters who did the Walter Reed story, but in the year 2000, a reporter named Kate Boo, who now writes for The New Yorker, and you probably see her byline from time to time, did an amazing story looking at the homes for the mentally retarded in the District of Columbia, and found conditions that were quite similar to what Hull and Priest found when they were working on the Walter Reed story. I'm looking forward to talking to them about that. I wonder if they know that that happened, because believe it or not, people at their very own newspapers do not know what stories have won Pulitzer Prizes. They don't know. And it is, the Washington Post may be a little different because they're so deeply ingrained, like the New York Times, it's part of the legend there. But by and large, there is an amazing amount of ignorance about the history of the newspapers that people work at. So any questions?
This is sort of a contrary question, but it's, were there any, which of all of the Pulitzer Gold stories, public service stories, was there one where you looked at it and go, I don't get it. Why did this publication get this? What was the backstory? And which one was it?
Yeah, well, there's an easy answer for that because it goes back to 1919, the very second Public Service Prize. So you can maybe excuse it because the Pulitzer Prizes really hadn't gotten their footing yet. They didn't really know what they were doing. Literally, they didn't in this case. And also, you have to think of what the time was like. But in the year 1919, the Milwaukee Journal was given the Public Service Pulitzer Prize for opposing Germanism in America. The feeling was that people thought that people who lived in Wisconsin were somehow suspect because they had German surnames. And so their contribution to a public service was to recommend that German not be taught in the public schools and that Wisconsin residents should stand up and say, we're Americans, we denounce our German heritage, and let's fight the war that way. That's a little bit difficult to understand today, and it just kind of jumps out as being one a product of that history. The Janet Cook case that a lot of people know about wasn't a public service award, but that was a prize where the reporter Janet Cook in the 80s, in a story called Jimmy's World, actually made up characters in a feature story about a child born of a drug addict mother. And it was a very dramatic story, won over the Pulitzer Board, really undermined the Washington Post. To this day, they still talk about that like it happened yesterday. Wasn't public service, though. Another question? Yes, sir. Hi.
Hi, Roy. This is purely speculative, but I was reminded recently that among the many little tidbits about Jason Blair was that he refused to write the Portraits of Grief features. He made up some excuse that a relative of his had died and it was too traumatic for him to do that. I'm wondering if he had taken part and had done what he usually did, how do you think we would be looking at that Pulitzer that the Times won for public service today?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never thought what a contribution he made to the Public Service Pulitzer Prize by ducking out of that. First of all, the conclusion that I reach is that the reason he didn't want to do it is because there was no glory in it. There wasn't a front page byline. They did have bylines on the stories. Well, they didn't. They had taglines on the stories. They were not identified with specific stories. So if you did, you know, the dishwasher and the windows on the world, and you wrote the story about that person, no one would ever know that you wrote that story. So his view was, there's no glory in this. This isn't going to advance my career, so I'm out of it. That's a great twist on it, though. I think they spent months going over every word that he'd written. One of the guys who was on the team, a guy named David Barstow, who won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of years later in 2004, and I got to know pretty well, was one of the guys assigned to investigating Jason Blair and what he'd written. So what they would have had to do was find which segment he had written. You remember that it was like a 12-page insert on everything that he'd written.
Oh, yeah.
To find that out. It's just amazing. So it might have cleaned the air some way, but I would think that taint would still be there. You would still have that feeling. As it turns out, it's a wonderful story for the book, because this idea that, first of all, these two senior editors, that their career from the total high point of 2002, that the next year they're out on their cans because of Jason Blair is absolutely incredible. And there's a big debate about Gerald Boyd, by the way, who was black. Gerald's the guy who died a few months after I talked to him. that there was an assumption at the paper that because he was a black editor, that he must have been Gerald Boyd's mentor. And I'm sorry, that he must have been Jason Blair's mentor. And Gerald and I talked about that, and he was absolutely insistent that he was tougher probably than most editors on Jason Blair, and was extremely upset by what had happened. They actually gave Jason Blair, Gerald Boyd's view was that they gave Jason Blair extra leeway to make mistakes because of this relationship that supposedly he had with a cousin who died in the World Trade Center. That they gave him a little extra rope because of that. No one wanted to come down on this cousin of the victim. Give me a break. Question in the back.
Could you tell me what do you think will happen to the newspaper industry, and what do you think of citizen journalism, or a citizen journalist? Who is a citizen journalist that got the whole thing going about the recent Barack Obama controversy?
Yeah, you know, there's so many interesting paths for the future going on that, you know, it's like nothing is ever new in a way. You know, you talk about, well, we're going back to, you know, private ownership of newspapers, and just from the ownership standpoint. Well, newspapers were privately owned back in the 1800s and early 1900s, and some really wonderful journalists, you know, led the newspaper industry into great journalism by private ownership. So that private ownership doesn't particularly bother me. It, in a way, may be better than a situation where shareholders are controlling the quality of a product. But the great concern has to do with the fact that the newspaper industry really doesn't have a model for growth. And
Well, that's what I was
yeah,
referring
it's
to. I mean,
a business model. It just doesn't have a business model for growth. They haven't figured out how to work in a profitable, and it's not just that it's not profitable, because actually newspapers are fairly profitable. The problem is that they don't have the kind of growth that's going to attract the traditional investors to that business. And they haven't figured out a way to make online revenues and print revenues work. Print costs are obviously a very difficult thing to deal with in this day and age. So from a business standpoint, I don't know. I think that probably we'll reach a plateau. Newspapers will shrink. They'll still have a much smaller market. The average age of a newspaper reader is now over 55 years old, which suggests to you that it's a much bigger problem than just a business model. So when you talk about citizen journalists, I think the Pulitzers are going to adjust to blogging. They're going to adjust to citizen journalism. They're going to have to find a way to do this, but they're going to be very cautious about it. They're going to be behind the curve because they're a bunch of conservative old fogies. Sorry, but they are. And you know, it's just not something I can predict. I think there's a lot of sadness ahead for the newspaper business. My only feeling of real, true hope is that the business still seems to attract aggressive young reporters who see what a newspaper can do and what an on-site newspaper can do. And they see that's a great place to get started in the business. And as long as you have these aggressive people like Gil Gall, and I hope like a lot of you, newspaper business is going to still have a lot of great aggressive reporting. Every year at the Pulitzer Prize time, you still see, may not see quite as many stories, but you see an incredible list. I'm trying not to use that word incredible. You should never say an incredible news story, right? You see this wonderful collection of stories, not just that wins the Pulitzer, but that's a finalist. And for every winner and finalist, there are dozens of other stories that in every one of the 14 categories that probably had a good shot at a prize. So at the very top level, you're still seeing excellent journalism, but the model that they're working within is extremely troubled, and it scares the daylights out of me, because I think newspapers are vital to the society that we have now, of keeping an eye on things like the courts, keeping an eye on the police station. Who else is going to do this? A blogger isn't going to do it, by and large, the way things are set up now. So it's a great worry. And I wish I could answer the question. Anything else? I could talk about this all night. And I will, in fact, if you come to the other speech.
Can I ask one more question?
Professor Leff, yes.
How political did you think these awards were? I mean, did you get a sense that there were a lot of politics in the deciding of who was going to get the particularly the public service?
Yeah, what I found, Laurel, was that that there was an evolution of the prizes that was a lot of fun to follow. That back in the 50s and 60s, it was extremely political. It was the classic white guys in ties. And not only that, but it was Eastern, heavily Eastern establishment. A guy named Arthur Kroc, who you may have heard of, from the New York Times, had this this breakfast club or dinner club, and he would take the board members out, and they'd kind of decide who was going to win the prize the next day. And whichever Joseph Pulitzer it was, who was the chairman at the time, was a pretty mild-mannered kind of guy, and didn't really run a tight ship. So if somebody kind of bulled their way in and had made up their mind beforehand, the decisions just got made. This was in the 50s and 60s. What I found was that right about at the time of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, there was such a shock because Columbia University, the system that was set up to govern the Pulitzer Prizes, had opposed both the Pentagon Papers and Watergate as being Pulitzer Prize winners. It was a total quirk, really, that they ended up winning. In the Washington Post, it was a matter of time. For those of us who were around for Watergate, you remember that the Watergate stories were not being picked up by the rest of the press. And it really wasn't until the judge in the case got some of the suspects in the case to admit that they were being paid off by the White House to shut up, that the rest of the press began to pay attention to them. And that happened to be a couple of weeks before the board met. I print in the book, I don't know if the board was too happy about this, but I actually printed a copy of the jury recommendation for public service that has, and I showed it to Bob Woodward, it has the Washington Post picked as their third choice. And one of the jurors actually said at that time that it was, they abused anonymous sources in order to make their point. And Bob Woodward said, "What do you mean, make our point? We weren't trying to make a point. We were trying to cover the story." So that page is in the book. And I thought that was kind of fun to kind of see, actually, sort of like the New York Times did in 1918, to see the original document. But in the late 1970s and 1980, there was a major reform. The board became much more diverse. They began to bring in jurors from all over the country, racially, diverse by gender and geographically. And my view now is when you talk to people who are on the board now, this diverse group of 19 people who are on the board, it is heaven on earth for them to be in that room. They feel like they can say things there they can't say anywhere else. That it's sort of, if you as a journalist feel like, I want to be somewhere where I can talk about what I really feel about this business, what I really feel about this story, it's in that room they can do it. It's like being in a jury. And that's the way they feel about it. And they're very persuasive when you talk to them. That it ain't about politics. It's about getting the best 14 pieces of coverage and making sure they're recognized. Well, thank you very much. This has been great.